A millionaire pretends to go bankrupt to test his family and his trust circle. Seeing everyone pull away, he discovers a conspiracy to take over his company. The investigation reveals sabotage, betrayal, and a complex plan from a close rival. Now he must expose the truth and rebuild his life amid the chaos. If this story interests you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. Michael Thompson had always been known in New York as a visionary businessman. At 45, he led Thompson Developments, one of the largest construction companies in the country, a legacy from his father that he had transformed into an even bigger empire. His office on the top floor of an imposing building on Wall Street was his refuge, where he spent most of his time analyzing projects and closing multi-million-dollar deals. On that March morning, as he observed the city through the panoramic windows of his office, something was bothering him. It wasn't the chaotic traffic below, nor the gray sky that threatened rain. It was a feeling that had been growing for months, like a shadow approaching stealthily. His secretary announced over the intercom that his sister, Rachel, was waiting to see him. She entered the room with her usual radiant smile, but Michael noticed something different in her eyes. It was the same look he had seen in other family members lately, a mixture of admiration and something else, something he couldn't quite define. "Michael, darling, we need to talk about that social project I mentioned. It would be wonderful to have Thompson Development's support." Rachel settled into the leather armchair, adjusting her designer dress. "I thought of something grandiose that could really make a difference." As he listened to his sister detail a project that would require millions in investments, Michael recalled the conversation he had accidentally overheard during the last family lunch. Rachel whispering to her husband about how convenient it would be to have access to a larger share of the Thompson fortune. "Rach, I'll carefully analyze your proposal," he responded diplomatically, observing her reaction. "But I need to consult the board of directors first." The disappointment on Rachel's face was almost imperceptible, but it was there. Of course. But remember that time is of the essence. Other companies have already shown interest." After his sister left, Michael picked up his cell phone and reread the latest messages from his cousin, Eric, the company's financial director. They were increasingly frequent requests for the release of extra funds, always justified with elaborate explanations about unique investment opportunities. Sarah, his wife of 15 years, was the only one who seemed immune to this obsession with money that he perceived in others. Or was she just more skilled at hiding her true intentions? The thought made him feel guilty instantly. Sarah had always been his safe harbor, his most sincere advisor. During dinner that night in their penthouse in Tribeca, Michael observed Sarah interacting with their teenage children, Emily and Nathan. She maintained that serene smile of always, helping Nathan with his math questions and listening attentively to Emily's stories about school. "You're very quiet today," Sarah commented after the children went up to their rooms. "Did something happen at the company?" Michael hesitated. How could he explain that corrosive feeling of distrust that was consuming his thoughts? How could he tell his own wife that sometimes he found himself questioning even her intentions? "I've been thinking, what would our life be like if I didn't have all this money?" The words came out before he could contain them. Sarah looked at him curiously. "What do you mean? If tomorrow I lost everything, if the company went bankrupt, how would people react? Who would really stand by my side? Michael, you're worrying me. Did something happen that I should know about?" He shook his head, but an idea was beginning to form in his mind. A bold idea, perhaps even dangerous, but one that could answer all his doubts once and for all. That night, lying next to Sarah, who slept peacefully, Michael began to elaborate his plan. It would be a test, a way to discover who really cared about him beyond his wealth. Pretend a bankruptcy. Announce that he had lost everything in unsuccessful investments. The idea kept him awake until dawn. As he watched the first rays of sunlight penetrate through the curtains, Michael made his decision. He would immediately begin preparations for his elaborate loyalty test. What he didn't know was that his search for truth would lead him to much deeper and more disturbing discoveries than he could ever imagine. His cell phone vibrated with a message from Eric. "We need to talk urgently about some investments." Michael looked at the screen with a mixture of sadness and determination. Yes, it was time to find out who the people around him truly were. The next morning, Michael arrived earlier at the office. The building was still practically empty except for some cleaning staff and night shift security guards. It was the perfect moment to start structuring his plan without raising suspicions. At his desk, he opened his laptop and began carefully analyzing the company's financial reports. If he wanted to convince everyone of an imminent bankruptcy, he would need to create a consistent story. It was then that something caught his attention, some subtle inconsistencies in the numbers from the last few quarters. "Mr. Thompson, your cousin Eric is here," his secretary announced over the intercom, interrupting his thoughts. Eric entered the room with his Italian leather briefcase and his usual air of studied concern. "Michael, we need to talk about that project in Greenwich. The projections have changed significantly." As his cousin presented a series of complex spreadsheets and graphs, Michael noticed a pattern in the inconsistencies he had noted earlier. They all seemed to coincide with projects directly supervised by Eric. "So what do you think?" Eric asked, adjusting his silk tie. "We need an additional injection of capital to ensure the success of the venture." Michael maintained his neutral expression. Years of negotiations had made him excellent at masking his emotions. "I'll analyze it carefully, Eric. By the way, I was thinking of having a family meeting next weekend. I have some important matters to discuss." The news of the family meeting spread quickly. Sarah organized a lunch at their house for Sunday, and Michael observed with interest how everyone promptly confirmed their attendance. His sister Rachel called 3 times to confirm the time and asked if she could bring her new boyfriend, a financial consultant. During the week, Michael carefully prepared the ground. He began canceling some important commitments, discreetly leaked to key employees that he was facing difficulties with some investments, and held tense meetings with his finance department. Sarah noticed the changes in her husband's behavior. On Thursday night, while the children were watching TV in the living room, she found him in the home office, immersed in documents. "You haven't left this office," she commented, placing a cup of tea on his desk. "Is something happening that you don't want to tell me?" Michael looked at his wife, studying her delicate features. After so many years together, he was still impressed by her sharp intuition. For a moment, he considered telling her about his plan, but something stopped him. "It's just some concerns with the company," he replied vaguely. "Nothing that can't be resolved." Sarah didn't seem convinced, but she didn't insist. You know you can count on me for anything, don't you?" Those words, spoken with such sincerity, made Michael question whether he was going too far with his plan. But then he remembered the whispered conversations, the interested looks, the increasingly frequent requests for money. On Saturday, the eve of the family meeting, Michael received an unexpected call from his old college friend, Jack Wilson, who had moved abroad years ago. "I heard you've been having some problems with the business," Jack commented casually. "If you need help, you know you can count on me." The call left Michael intrigued. How did Jack, who had been in London for so long, know about his supposed financial difficulties? Who else was spreading rumors about his situation? That night, while preparing the final details for the next day, Michael found in his email inbox an anonymous message with internal company documents. Documents that shouldn't be circulating outside the board of directors. Sunday dawned with a light rain in New York. Michael watched the drops run down the window of his bedroom, thinking about how that day would change everything. Little did he know that his plan to test people's loyalty would end up revealing much deeper secrets than he could imagine. The Sunday lunch began promptly at noon. The Thompson mansion in the Hamptons was full of relatives, all impeccably dressed as if it were a special occasion. The mahogany table, a family heirloom for generations, was set with the best china and silver cutlery. Sarah was supervising the last details of the buffet when Rachel arrived, accompanied by her new boyfriend, Charles Vanderbilt. The man with his Italian suit and luxury watch immediately began circulating among those present, distributing business cards and talking about investment opportunities. Michael observed everything from his office on the upper floor through the window overlooking the garden. He saw when Eric arrived with his wife, Amanda, both whispering something as they walked through the garden. His Aunt Margaret, president of the board of directors, was one of the last to arrive, always majestic in her navy blue silk ensemble. "Are you ready?" Sarah asked, entering the office. "The guests are asking about you." Michael adjusted his tie in front of the mirror. "Yes, let's go down." The meal proceeded with the usual formality of Thompson family gatherings. Conversations about business, comments about the real estate market, and the inevitable comparisons between each one's children's achievements. Michael remained unusually quiet, responding only when directly questioned. It was during dessert that he finally stood up, gently tinkling his crystal glass with a piece of silverware. Silence gradually took over the environment. "Family," he began, his voice firm but with a carefully calculated note of regret. "I gathered everyone here today because I need to share something important." The looks turned to him, some curious, others already showing concern. Sarah, seated to his right, observed him with special attention. In recent months, Thompson Developments has faced a series of setbacks. Her investments that seemed promising turned out to be disastrous. Important projects were cancelled. He paused dramatically. "We are on the verge of bankruptcy." The silence that followed was deafening. Michael could practically hear the gears turning in everyone's mind. But how? Rachel was the first to find her voice. "You've always been so careful with business." Eric shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Why didn't you consult me about these investments? As financial director, I should have been informed." "They were decisions made quickly," Michael explained, noticing how his cousin seemed genuinely disturbed. "I thought I could reverse the situation before it became serious." Aunt Margaret maintained an impassive expression, her astute eyes fixed on Michael. "And what about the company's reserves, the emergency fund?" "All compromised," Michael replied, observing how Charles, Rachel's boyfriend, discreetly put his business card back in his pocket. Sarah remained silent, but her hand found Michael's under the table, squeezing it gently. That simple gesture caught him by surprise. "I'll need to sell this house," he continued. "Maybe even our apartment in the city. The children will have to change school." "No," Sarah interrupted, surprising everyone. "We'll sell my jewelry store in the mall first. I was thinking about retiring anyway." Michael looked at his wife, genuinely touched by her offer. That jewelry store was Sarah's lifelong dream. The family meeting dissolved quickly after the announcement. The excuses to leave were varied. Unavoidable commitments, children to pick up from Sunday activities, work meetings to prepare. As the cars left the property one by one, Michael noticed how his cell phone, previously constantly bombarded with messages from family members, remained strangely silent. Only one message arrived, from an unknown number. "Maybe we can find a solution to your situation. We need to talk in private." Night fell over the Thompson mansion, now silent except for the sound of Sarah's footsteps, who was organizing the kitchen with her usual efficiency. Michael observed her, thinking about how her reaction had been the only truly surprising one that day. But a doubt still gnawed at him. Was that concern genuine or part of a larger plan that he still couldn't see? On the Monday following the announcement, the atmosphere at Thompson Developments was charged with tension. Michael arrived early as usual, but noticed different looks from the employees, a mixture of pity and apprehension that he had never experienced before. His secretary, Mrs. Johnson, who had worked with him for more than 2 decades, placed his coffee cup on the desk with slightly trembling hands. "Mr. Thompson, I've already cancelled your appointments for this week, as requested, and, well, you've received several calls." Michael examined the list of messages. Most were from business partners and bankers, all wanting to talk about the situation. Among them, a message from Jack Wilson, his friend from London, stood out, informing that he would be in New York next week. While reviewing documents at his desk, he noticed unusual movement in the hallway. Eric passed hurriedly by his office door several times, always on the phone, speaking in a low voice. On one of the occasions, Michael managed to catch fragments of the conversation. "No, we can't let this happen. I need to check the numbers again." Around noon, Rachel appeared without warning. Her countenance was different from usual, the radiant smile replaced by a studied expression of concern. "Little brother," she began, sitting down without being invited, "I've been thinking, maybe we should postpone that social project we discussed. You know how it is. I don't want to overburden you at this difficult time." Michael nodded, observing how his sister avoided looking directly at the expensive paintings that decorated his office, as if she was already imagining them being sold at an auction. "Actually," Rachel continued, "Charles mentioned that he knows some investors interested in buying properties. If you need to get rid of some real estate—" "I appreciate your concern, Rach," Michael interrupted, "but I'm still evaluating all options." After his sister left, Michael received a call from his Aunt Margaret. Her voice conveyed that characteristic authority from years at the head of the board of directors. "Michael, I've called an extraordinary board meeting for Thursday. Your presence is essential. We need to discuss emergency measures." During lunch, which he barely touched, Michael received a message from Sarah. "Just got out of a meeting with my accountant. Can we talk about some ideas when you get home?" That message made him reflect. Sarah was really committed to helping, mobilizing her own resources. Could it be possible that he was wrong to include her in his suspicions? In the afternoon, Eric finally entered his office carrying a folder full of documents. His face showed a mixture of concern and something else. Anxiety, perhaps. "Michael, I've been analyzing the latest financial reports," he began, spreading papers on the desk. "There are some movements that don't make sense, investments that didn't go through my department. Can you explain this?" Michael studied his cousin for a moment. "They're special projects that I personally supervised," he replied vaguely. "But that's irregular," Eric protested, his face turning red. "As financial director, I should have been consulted unless—" He stopped abruptly, as if he had said too much. Before the conversation could continue, Mrs. Johnson announced over the intercom that the company's lawyer was on the line urgently. At the end of the day, while organizing his desk to leave, Michael found an unmarked envelope among his papers. Inside, there was only a card with a typed message. "Not all is lost. There's more at stake than you imagine. Tomorrow, 10 a.m., Central Park Cafe." Michael put the card in his pocket, intrigued. The reactions to his announcement were revealing more than he expected, but also raising new questions. Who had left that envelope? And why did some people seem more disturbed by his supposed bankruptcy than he himself? On the way home, his cell phone rang again. It was an unknown number, but the voice on the other end was familiar, although he couldn't immediately identify whose it was. "Mr. Thompson, we need to talk about some documents that have come into my hands. You'll want to see this." The next morning, Michael arrived at Central Park Cafe exactly at 10 a.m. The place, a charming establishment in the heart of Manhattan, was relatively quiet at that hour. He chose a discreet table in the back with a view of the entrance. While waiting, he reflected on the events of the last 24 hours. The reactions to the news of his supposed bankruptcy had been revealing, but also confusing. Some people seemed genuinely concerned, while others showed an almost suspicious interest in his financial situation. At 10:05, a familiar figure entered the cafe. Michael felt his heart race as he recognized Lisa Parker, a former employee of Thompson Development's legal department. She had left the company about 6 months ago, under somewhat nebulous circumstances. "Mr. Thompson," Lisa greeted, sitting across from him. Her expression was a mixture of nervousness and determination. "Thank you for coming. I confess I was surprised by your contact, Lisa," Michael responded, studying her carefully, "especially considering how you left the company." Lisa took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. "What I have to show you explains a lot about my departure and about what's happening now with the company." She opened her briefcase and pulled out a series of documents. Michael immediately recognized the Thompson Development's letterhead on some of them. "These are contracts and financial reports that I found by chance before I left," Lisa explained, her voice low and urgent. "There are significant discrepancies, Mr. Thompson. Unauthorized transactions, diversion of funds to offshore accounts." Michael leafed through the papers, feeling a weight in his stomach. The inconsistencies he had noticed earlier were just the tip of the iceberg. The documents in his hands revealed a complex scheme of fraud and financial manipulations. "Why are you showing me this now?" he asked, his mind racing to process the implications. Lisa hesitated for a moment. "When I left the company, it was because I realized something was wrong. I tried to investigate on my own, but I received threats. I decided to step away. But when I heard about your financial difficulties, I realized I couldn't stay silent anymore." As they continued the conversation, Michael noticed a man sitting a few tables away, apparently absorbed in his laptop, but casting furtive glances in their direction. Instinctively, he lowered his voice even more. "Who else knows about this?" he inquired. "I'm not sure," Lisa replied, "but I believe it involves people in the company's upper echelons, maybe even board members." Michael's mind was spinning. His plan to test people's loyalty around him had inadvertently revealed something much bigger and more dangerous. The bankruptcy he was pretending could be more real than he imagined. After Lisa left, Michael remained at the cafe, analyzing the documents. His cell phone vibrated with a message from Sarah. "I managed to schedule a meeting with a financial consultant to discuss our options. Can we go together?" That message made him pause. Sarah continued to show unwavering support. Was it possible that he had misjudged her by including her in his initial suspicions? As he left the cafe, Michael noticed that the man who had been observing him was also getting up to leave. As a precaution, he decided to take a different route back to the office. In the elevator at Thompson Developments, he found himself with Eric. His cousin seemed tense, avoiding eye contact. "Michael," Eric began hesitantly, "about that conversation yesterday. I think we need to discuss some details of the latest investments. There are things you need to know." Before Michael could respond, the elevator doors opened and Aunt Margaret entered, interrupting the conversation. "Ah, good to find you both," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Can we move our meeting forward to this afternoon? Some urgent matters have come up." Michael nodded, feeling the weight of the documents in his briefcase. He knew the next few hours would be crucial. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, but the image they formed was much more complex and disturbing than he could have imagined. The meeting room on the top floor of Thompson Developments was immersed in tense silence. Michael observed the members of the board of directors settling around the large mahogany table. Aunt Margaret sat at the head as usual, her expression impassive. Eric occupied the seat to her right, avoiding Michael's gaze. "Well, gentlemen," Margaret began, her firm voice echoing in the room, "I believe we are all aware of the gravity of the situation. Michael, please update us on the latest occurrences." Michael took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the documents Lisa had given him in his briefcase. He knew that every word he said now could change the course not only of the company, but of his life and the people around him. "Before we begin," he said, carefully measuring his words, "I'd like to know if anyone has anything to add about our current financial situation. Something that perhaps I'm not aware of?" A heavy silence fell over the room. Michael noticed Eric shifting uncomfortably in his chair, while another board member, Dr. Harris, nervously cleaned his glasses. It was Aunt Margaret who broke the silence. "Michael, dear, I think you're being a bit dramatic. I'm sure we can find a solution to these little setbacks without unnecessarily alarming our shareholders." "Little setbacks?" Michael repeated, a touch of irony in his voice. "Aunt, we're talking about significant financial discrepancies, unauthorized investments, suspicious transfers." Eric abruptly interrupted. "Michael, you can't be suggesting that there was some kind of irregularity, can you?" Eric's defensive tone didn't go unnoticed. Michael decided to push a little more. "What I'm saying, Eric, is that there are transactions that didn't go through the company's standard protocol. And curiously, many of them coincide with the dates of our family meetings." Eric's face visibly paled. Dr. Harris cleared his throat, interrupting the tense moment. Perhaps it's better we consult our legal team before making any hasty accusations." "Excellent idea," Aunt Margaret quickly agreed. "Michael, why don't we schedule another meeting for next week? This will give us time to properly review all the documents." Michael perceived the obvious attempt to buy time. "Actually," he said, opening his briefcase, "I have some documents here that I'd like everyone to analyze now." Before he could distribute the papers, his cell phone vibrated. It was a message from Sarah. "Urgent. Need to talk to you. It's about the company." The momentary interruption gave Aunt Margaret the chance she needed. "I think we're all a bit exhausted today. I suggest we end here and resume when we're more prepared." As the board members quickly dispersed, Michael noticed Eric whispering something to Dr. Harris in the hallway. The expression of both was one of evident concern. Returning to his office, Michael found a surprise. Jack Wilson, his friend from London, was waiting for him. "Michael, my old friend," Jack greeted him effusively. "I came as soon as I heard the news. I think I can help with your financial problems." The unexpected presence of Jack, combined with the urgent message from Sarah and the suspicious behavior of the board, made Michael realize that he was at the center of a much more complex web than he had initially imagined. "Jack," Michael said cautiously, "I appreciate your concern. But before we discuss anything, I need to make an important call." As he dialed Sarah's number, Michael observed Jack through his office window. His old friend seemed nervous, constantly checking his cell phone. Sarah's voice on the other end of the line sounded tense. Michael, I discovered something. That financial consultant we met with. He has connections with Eric and an offshore company in the Cayman Islands. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, forming an alarming picture. Michael realized that his initial plan to test people's loyalty had triggered a series of events that were rapidly spiraling out of his control. As he listened to Sarah detail her discoveries, Michael noticed movement in the hallway. Eric and Dr. Harris passed by hurriedly, carrying boxes of documents. The net was closing in, and Michael knew he needed to act quickly before the evidence disappeared, or worse, before he became the scapegoat for a scheme much larger than he could have imagined. Night was falling over New York when Michael finally left the office. The congested streets reflected the turmoil in his mind. The conversation with Sarah, the suspicious reactions of the board, Jack's unexpected arrival, everything mixed into a complex and alarming puzzle. Arriving home, he found Sarah in the living room, surrounded by piles of documents and her open laptop. Her eyes, normally serene, were tense with worry. Tense. "Michael," she began as soon as he entered, "you won't believe what I've discovered." He sat down next to her, noticing the dark circles forming under her eyes. "Tell me everything," he asked, holding her hand in a gesture of support. Sarah took a deep breath before starting. "Remember that financial consultant we met? Well, I did some research. He's not just an ordinary consultant. He has links to a network of shell companies in the Cayman Islands." Michael felt a chill down his spine. "And how does this connect to Thompson Developments?" "That's where things get interesting," Sarah continued, turning the laptop screen towards him. "I found regular transfers from our company to one of these offshore companies, all approved by Eric." Michael's mind was reeling. The inconsistencies he had noticed, the documents Lisa had given him, everything was starting to make a terrible sense. "There's more," Sarah went on, her voice lowering as if she feared being overheard. "I discovered emails exchanged between Eric and Aunt Margaret discussing these transfers. They were deliberately hiding information from you, Michael." The shock of betrayal hit him like a punch to the stomach. People he trusted, his own family, were behind a scheme to divert resources from the company. "And Jack?" Michael asked, remembering his friend's unexpected visit. Sarah frowned. "I didn't find anything concrete about him, but his sudden arrival is suspicious at the very least." At that moment, Michael's cell phone vibrated with a message. It was from an unknown number. "If you want to know the whole truth, meet me tomorrow at 7 a.m. in Central Park. Come alone." Michael showed the message to Sarah, who immediately expressed concern. "It could be a trap. We don't know who's behind this, but it might be our only chance to understand what's really going on," Michael argued. They spent the following hours reviewing every piece of information they had, trying to connect the dots. The magnitude of the conspiracy that was revealing itself was frightening. It wasn't just about misappropriation of funds. There seemed to be an elaborate plan to gradually remove Michael from control of the company. Close to midnight, exhausted but determined, they finally went to bed. Michael, however, couldn't sleep. His mind replayed every interaction, every conversation from the last few months, looking for signs he might have missed. At 6:30 a.m. the next morning, Michael quietly left the house, leaving a note for Sarah. Central Park was quiet at that hour, with only a few morning joggers. As he walked near the lake, he saw a familiar figure approaching. His heart almost stopped when he recognized who it was. Mrs. Johnson, his faithful secretary for more than 2 decades. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice trembling. "Sorry for the mystery, but I needed to speak with you in private." "Mrs. Johnson, what's going on?" Michael asked, confused and alarmed. The elderly lady looked around nervously before speaking. "For months I've been noticing strange things. Documents disappearing, secret meetings. I wanted to speak up before, but I was afraid. Last night I overheard a conversation between Eric and Dr. Harris. They're planning something big for this afternoon. Something that, according to them, will solve the Michael problem once and for all." The implications of those words hit Michael like lightning. The plan he had initiated to test people's loyalty around him had transformed into something much more dangerous and real than he could have imagined. As the sun rose over the park, Michael realized he was in the middle of a battle for the survival of everything he had built. And time was running out. Michael left Central Park with his mind in turmoil. Mrs. Johnson's revelations confirmed his worst suspicions and added an alarming urgency to the situation. He needed to act. and fast. On the way back home, he called Sarah. "Honey, we need to accelerate our plan. Things are worse than we imagined." Sarah, already awake and alert, responded promptly. "Understood. What do we do now?" "Meet me at the office in an hour. Bring all the documents we've gathered. It's time to turn the tables." Arriving home, Michael quickly got ready, changing his casual clothes for one of his best suits. He knew that the appearance of confidence would be crucial for what he was about to do. On the way to the office, he made a series of calls. The first was to his personal lawyer, Robert Meyer. "Robert, I need you to come to Thompson Developments immediately. Bring all the documentation about the company's corporate structure." Next, he contacted Lisa Parker. "Lisa, I know it's risky, but I need you to come to the office today. Your evidence might be crucial." Finally, to his surprise, he decided to call Jack Wilson. "Jack, old friend, how about coffee at the company today? I have some interesting proposals to discuss." Upon arriving at Thompson Developments, Michael was greeted by curious looks and whispers from employees. Clearly, rumors about the company's situation had spread. He maintained a firm posture, greeting everyone with a confident smile. In his office, he found Sarah already waiting for him. "I gained access to more compromising emails," she said, showing him her tablet. "Eric has been in frequent contact with a group of foreign investors. It seems they're planning a hostile takeover." Michael nodded, absorbing the information. That explains a lot. They were weakening the company from within to facilitate the takeover. In the following minutes, Robert Meyer and Lisa Parker arrived, bringing with them piles of documents and drives full of digital files. Michael quickly brought them up to speed on the situation, rapidly outlining a plan of action. "We're going to call an emergency board meeting," Michael announced. "But first we need to make sure we have all the necessary evidence." While the improvised team worked frantically to organize the evidence, Jack Wilson arrived. Michael greeted him with studied cordiality, carefully observing his reactions. "Jack, glad you could make it. We're about to make some significant changes in the company. I'd like to hear your opinion on some international investments." Jack's expression oscillated between interest and apprehension. "Of course, Michael, always happy to help an old friend." The following hours were a race against time. Michael and his team reviewed contracts, analyzed financial transactions, and mapped out the network of connections linking Eric, Aunt Margaret, and the foreign investors. Around 2 p.m., Michael called the board meeting. When the members began to arrive, they found not only Michael, but also Robert, Lisa, and to the surprise of many, FBI agents. "Ladies and gentlemen," Michael began, his firm voice echoing through the meeting room, "I believe we have much to discuss about the future of Thompson Developments." Eric's face visibly paled, while Aunt Margaret maintained a defiant expression. The other board members looked confused and alarmed. "Before we begin," Michael continued, "I'd like to present some evidence about certain irregularities that have been discovered in our financial management." As the evidence was presented, compromising emails, records of suspicious transactions, doctored documents, the atmosphere in the room changed drastically. Accusations and denials flew back and forth, with Eric and Aunt Margaret desperately trying to defend themselves. It was at this moment that Jack Wilson, who had been invited to the meeting, surprisingly spoke up. "Michael, I think it's time I confess my role in all this. I was approached by the foreign investors months ago. They wanted me to be an intermediary, but I couldn't betray our friendship." Jack's revelation was the final blow. With the evidence presented and the unexpected confession, the corruption scheme and the attempted hostile takeover were completely exposed. As the FBI agents began to ask questions and collect statements, Michael found himself at the center of a whirlwind of emotions. The company his father had founded and that he had expanded was on the brink of collapse, but now there was a chance to save it. Looking at Sarah, who remained by his side, strong and determined, Michael realized that the loyalty test he had initiated had resulted in something much deeper, a revelation about who was really on his side and the true value of trust. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in months, Michael felt he was in control again. The future was uncertain, but he was ready to face it, with truth as his most powerful weapon. In the weeks that followed the dramatic board meeting, Thompson Developments entered a period of intense restructuring. Michael, now more than ever, was at the center of a hurricane of changes. crucial decisions and ongoing revelations. The first order of business was dealing with the legal consequences. Eric and Aunt Margaret were removed from their positions while the FBI investigations advanced. Dr. Harris, surprisingly, decided to cooperate with the authorities, providing valuable information about the corruption scheme in exchange for a plea deal. Michael spent entire days in meetings with lawyers, auditors, and investigators. Each new discovery brought to light more layers of complexity in the scheme that had almost destroyed his company. It was during one of these sessions that a particularly shocking revelation came to light. "Mr. Thompson," said one of the auditors, "we've found evidence that the scheme began much earlier than we thought. In fact, it seems to have started during your father's management." The news hit Michael like a punch to the stomach. His father, the man he had always seen as an example of integrity, possibly involved in corrupt practices. The idea was almost inconceivable. Sarah, perceiving the emotional impact of this revelation on Michael, suggested that they take a few days off to process everything that was happening. "You need time to think, to reconnect with what really matters," she insisted. Reluctantly, Michael agreed. They decided to spend a weekend at the family's old country house, a place Michael hadn't visited since his youth. As they drove to upstate New York, the silence in the car was heavy, laden with unspoken reflections. At the country house, surrounded by nature and away from the chaos of the city, Michael finally allowed himself to break down. Sitting on the porch, looking at the distant mountains, he cried for the first time since it all began. Sarah hugged him in silence, offering the comfort of her presence. "So how could I have been so blind?" Michael murmured between sobs. "So many years, so many people I trusted." Sarah held his face in her hands, looking into his eyes. "Michael, you're not responsible for other people's choices. What matters is how you choose to act now." Those words triggered a long conversation between them. They talked about the past, about the pressures and expectations that came with the Thompson name, about the sacrifices they had both made over the years. On Sunday afternoon, as they were packing to return to the city, Michael found an old box in the attic. Inside were letters and documents from his father. With trembling hands, he began to read them. What he discovered left him stunned. The letters revealed that his father had, in fact, discovered irregularities in the company years ago, but instead of denouncing them, he had tried to quietly correct them, fearing the scandal that could destroy everything he had built. He was trying to protect the company, protect the family, Michael reflected, his voice choked. But in doing so, he ended up creating the conditions for the problem to grow. Back in New York, Michael faced the week with a new perspective. He called a press conference where, for the first time, he spoke openly about everything that had happened. He acknowledged the mistakes of the past, including those of his father, and presented a detailed plan to completely overhaul Thompson Development's governance. "I can't change the past," he said before the cameras, "but I can ensure a future of transparency and integrity for this company." In the days that followed, Michael worked tirelessly on implementing new policies and procedures. He hired an external permanent audit team, established an anonymous whistleblowing channel for employees, and initiated a business ethics training program for all levels of the organization. The rebuilding process would be long and difficult, but Michael felt stronger and more determined than ever. The crisis that had almost destroyed everything he valued had ironically cleared his vision and reaffirmed his core values. One night, while reviewing some documents in his home office, Sarah quietly entered, bringing 2 cups of tea. She smiled, seeing Michael's concentrated expression. "You know," she began, sitting next to him, "when you started that crazy plan of pretending a bankruptcy, I never imagined we'd end up here." Michael laughed softly, taking the cup she offered. "Neither did I. But I'm grateful to have you by my side every step of the way." As they savored the tea together, talking about the challenges that were still to come, Michael felt a deep sense of peace. The road ahead would be difficult, but he wasn't alone. With Sarah by his side and a clear vision of what needed to be done, he was ready to face any obstacle that arose. Thompson Developments was far from being completely healed, but the first steps towards a more ethical and transparent future had been taken. And for Michael, this was more valuable than any fortune he might have lost in the process. The months that followed were of intense transformation for Thompson Developments. Michael, now more aware than ever of the importance of transparency and ethics in business, led a series of radical changes in the company. One Monday morning, Michael gathered all employees in the main lobby of the building. The buzz ceased when he climbed onto the small improvised stage. "Good morning, everyone," he began, his voice echoing through the environment. "Today marks the beginning of a new era for Thompson Developments, an era of transparency, integrity, and social responsibility." He then detailed the changes that would be implemented: a new independent ethics board, compliance training programs for all hierarchical levels, partnerships with corporate transparency NGOs, and a revolutionary profit-sharing system for employees. "We will no longer be just a development company," Michael declared, his eyes shining with determination. "We will be an example of how a company can thrive by doing the right thing." The reaction was mixed. Some employees applauded enthusiastically, others seemed skeptical. Michael knew that trust would take time to be rebuilt, but he was willing to do whatever was necessary. Meanwhile, investigations into the corruption scheme continued. Eric and Aunt Margaret faced legal proceedings, and each new revelation brought to light more details about the extent of the fraud. Michael, true to his commitment to transparency, fully cooperated with the authorities, even when it meant exposing past flaws of the company. One day, while reviewing some old documents, Michael found something surprising: a letter from his father written shortly before his death, addressed to him but never delivered. With trembling hands, he opened it. "My son, if you're reading this, it means I didn't have the courage to tell you in person. Years ago, I discovered irregularities in the company. I tried to correct them quietly, fearing the scandal, but now I see that was my biggest mistake. Don't repeat my errors, Michael. Integrity must always come first, no matter the cost. Forgive me for not being the example you deserved. I trust you will do what is right. With love, your father." Tears ran down Michael's face as he read and reread the letter. It was a late but powerful validation of everything he was trying to do now. Inspired by his father's letter, Michael decided to take one more bold step. He called a meeting with the main business leaders of New York, including some of his biggest competitors. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, facing the room full of curious and some skeptical faces, "I'm here today not to talk about business, but about responsibility. What happened at Thompson Developments is not an isolated case. It's a symptom of a business culture that needs to change." He then proposed the creation of a business ethics pact, a joint commitment from all major construction and development companies to adopt more transparent and responsible practices. "We can compete in business, but we must be united in our commitment to integrity," he concluded. The proposal was received with a mix of surprise and interest. Some leaders committed immediately, others promised to consider it. But everyone left the meeting with the feeling that something important had begun. That night at home, Michael shared the events of the day with Sarah. She listened attentively, her eyes shining with pride. "You're really changing things," she said, holding his hand. "Not just in the company, but in the entire sector." Michael smiled, tired but satisfied. "It's a start," he replied. "There's still a lot of work ahead." As they prepared for bed, Michael reflected on the journey of the past few months. What had begun as a loyalty test had transformed into a complete reinvention not only of his company, but of himself as a leader and as a person. Looking out the window at the city lights, Michael felt a mixture of hope and determination. The road ahead would be challenging, but he was ready to face it. With Sarah by his side, and with a clear vision of his values and goals, he knew he could overcome any obstacle. Thompson Developments was being reborn, not just as a more ethical and transparent company, but as a beacon of change for the entire business sector. And Michael, the man who had almost lost everything, had found something much more valuable in the process: a true purpose and the courage to pursue it no matter the cost. 5 years had passed since the great revelations and changes at Thompson Developments. What began as a personal and business crisis for Michael had become a movement for change that reverberated throughout the real estate sector and beyond. On an autumn morning, Michael walked through the company corridors, observing the bustle of activity. New faces mingled with the old, all working with a common purpose. The walls, once adorned only with profit charts, now also displayed photos of community projects and sustainability certifications. Arriving at the main meeting room, Michael paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. Today was a special day. Thompson Developments was about to officially sign the Corporate Integrity Pact, an initiative he had proposed years ago that was finally coming to life on a large scale. As he entered the room, he was greeted by an eclectic mix of people: CEOs of other major construction companies, NGO leaders, government representatives, and, to his surprise, some familiar faces he hadn't seen in years. "Michael!" a familiar voice called out. It was Eric, his cousin, who had served his sentence and now worked on rehabilitation projects for former executives. Next to him was Aunt Margaret, visibly aged, but with a look of genuine remorse. Michael greeted them with a firm handshake. "I'm glad you could come," he said sincerely. Time and reflection had softened his anger, replacing it with a deeper understanding of human frailty. The signing ceremony was brief, but loaded with meaning. One by one, the largest companies in the sector committed to rigorous standards of ethics, transparency, and social responsibility. When it was Michael's turn to sign, he paused, looking at the pen in his hand, the same one his father used to sign important contracts. "This," he said, turning to the audience, "is not just a commitment on paper. It's a promise for the future, a statement that we can and must do business in a way that benefits not just ourselves, but society as a whole." After the ceremony, as guests mingled at a reception, Michael found himself surrounded by his family. Sarah, radiant with pride, was by his side. Emily, now a young adult about to graduate in environmental engineering, was animatedly discussing new sustainable projects with some executives. Nathan, still in high school, observed everything with curious eyes, absorbing every detail. "Dad," Emily said, turning to Michael, "remember that letter you started writing to us years ago? I think it's time to update it." Michael smiled, remembering the notebook he had filled with his reflections and lessons over the years. "You're right, daughter, but this time I want you to contribute too. The company's future will be shaped by your ideas and values." At that moment, Rachel approached timidly. In recent years, she had dedicated herself to volunteer work, seeking her own redemption. "Michael, I wanted to say how proud I am of you, of what you've built here." The hug that followed was a moment of healing for both, a symbol that even the deepest wounds could be healed with time, understanding, and forgiveness. That night, back at the family home, Michael sat on his porch watching the sunset over the city. Sarah joined him, bringing 2 glasses of wine. "You know," she began, handing him a glass, "when you started that crazy plan of pretending a bankruptcy, I could never have imagined we'd end up here." Michael chuckled softly. "Neither could I." "It's been quite a journey, hasn't it?" "It has," Sarah agreed, leaning back in her chair, "but it was worth every moment." As they savored the wine in comfortable silence, Michael reflected on the incredible journey of the past few years. What had begun as a loyalty test had transformed into a complete revolution, not just in his life and company, but in an entire sector. Thompson Developments was no longer just a name on a building or a line in a financial statement. It was a symbol of integrity, innovation, and social responsibility. And Michael knew that his true legacy wasn't in the buildings he constructed, but in the lives he transformed and the example he left for future generations. Looking at Sarah, at the city stretching out before them, and thinking of his children and the company they would one day inherit, Michael felt a deep sense of accomplishment and peace. The circle was complete. What had begun as a crisis of trust had transformed into a powerful affirmation of the power of integrity, the courage to change, and the importance of staying true to one's values. And so, as the stars began to dot the night sky, Michael raised his glass in a silent toast to the past that had brought them here, to the purpose-filled present, and to the bright future unfolding before them.